intelligent way on the society would adopt it. But all my efforts to persuade anybody to actually do these things fail. And I'm better placed than most people. I have a national newspaper column. I occasionally broadcast. I can get books published sometimes. So I have some power to influence, but I can get nowhere with it. So I regard myself as writing the obituary of my country. It may be, you lot will be taking over before long, it may be that you will see the tremendous, let's use a polite word, mess that my generation has made this country over the past 45, 50 years, and think that you want to put it right. And one of the mistakes we made was the one over drugs. I'm hoping so. But at the moment, I'd say I see absolutely no hope whatever of anyone in any political party anywhere near government paying any attention at all to anything that I say. So it's really, I say it because it would be stupid not to say it, and wrong not to say it, because it's true, but not in any great hope of it being implemented. Totally.
So we've heard a lot about cannabis. Are you happy with the implementation of the law when it comes to harder drugs?
Well, it's interesting. You would think, wouldn't you, that given whenever they relax the law about cannabis, they say this will free up. Why does it always free up? Why is it going to be free down? Free up the police. And here I'm going to have to refer to my index to pursue the harder drugs, as the police always call them, heroin and cocaine. Well, some parliamentary questions were asked on this a couple of years ago, and it turns out that it isn't actually like that at all. And some of you may have heard of an alleged pop singer called Pete Doherty. Baby shuffles, isn't it? He was actually in court not very long ago, and as he was walking out of the court, where he'd appeared, I think, on heroin possession charge, he reached into the pockets of his coat and some heroin fell out, which was observed by the security guard. And he was taken back into court. And what do you think happened to him? Any guesses? I think the expression "two parts of damn all" would be about it. Nothing. And then there was the case of the Rousings. You may have heard of the Rousings, one who died in tragic circumstances recently, who were actually found in possession of Class A drugs in the United States Embassy. An unwise spot to pick, you think. And again, what happened to them? Nothing. What Nicola Blackwell, the MP for Oxford West and Abingdon, found was that the number of people convicted for particularly for supply of these drugs, doesn't actually change much from year to year. You would have thought that the government concentrated on supply as it does, and saying it was making more of an effort. So, for instance, convictions for supply of Class A drugs were 2,633 in 2007, 2,968 in 2008, 2,804 in 2009, and then when several policemen had been freed up to do something more about this in 2010, the figure had dropped to 2,530. It seems to me they're going through the motions. I don't think that law is enforced either, and I don't think there's any evidence. Police officers make speeches about it, but in fact they do nothing. The police fundamentally are uninterested. They go through the motions of seizing the occasional cargo and of raiding the occasional house to make it look as if they're doing something, but the actual business of stopping people from taking them, of interdicting supply, is of no interest in them at all, and they don't do it. And that's one of the reasons why it doesn't stop, because if you try to interdict supply, you don't interdict demand, nothing will happen. And this raises the Mr. Big question, because I was expecting it to come up before now. What about, a very good question, what about the countries ruined, I think it's Mexico and Colombia and Afghanistan, ruined by the dependence on the drug trade? What about them? Surely legalizing the trade will save them. It's not true. The reason why those countries are ruined by the drug trade, and the only reason why it's been possible, is because the huge flow of pounds and euros and dollars from spoiled, selfish, rich kids in Western countries who buy these drugs and who create the trade and make it worthwhile for enough gangsters to control it. If the stuff wasn't being bought, there'd be no trade. The buyers are Mr. Big. Effectively, it's you, by buying it, who keep this thing going. And if it was stopped, if you didn't buy it, then you kill the trade. Rob?
Do you think that there's, what do you think the politicians should be doing right now about the massive influx or creation, if you like, or importing of so-called legal highs, drugs that have not been criminalised yet, but that are generally seen as being dangerous?
The legislation on this that was passed last year is extremely interesting. And one of the things it did was it made all psychoactive drugs illegal, except caffeine. I think there was one other. So there was some drug that certain people like to use while they're having sex that was also exempted. But unless it was named as an exemption, if it's a psychoactive drug, it was illegal. So they're all automatically illegal unless otherwise stated. But the fascinating thing about the law was that there was no offence of possession. So the law began where the cannabis laws ended. They went through the motions of pretending to be concerned, but they left out of the law the only serious weapon they could actually have used to control drugs. So what the government has decided to do is nothing but to make it look like something. And this is more or less government policy. You will never get a government minister not to say anything other than we are doing all that we can to suppress this evil trade. They always say it. They will never ever admit to what it is that they're doing. So on this occasion, it was extraordinarily clear by the fact that the legislation actively avoided touching possession that this is the key to what they do. They will make a fuss to show about trafficking, but they will do nothing about the actual purchase and taking of the drugs, which means that the law is pretty much limitless. What I think of that, I don't think much of it.
I'm trying to understand the crux of your argument, which seems to be that you want the police to enforce the laws more severely because the drugs may be bad for people based on nothing but the fact that correlation may not equal causation, but might. So based on no facts, no evidence, no stats, no numbers, but this vague notion that it might be dangerous. So you want to imprison people for the fact they might have mental health problems down the line. Am I doing this right?
No, I don't think you are. I think you're caricaturing an idea you wish to reject.
I wish
it
was more intellectually stimulating.
No, and in wishing to reject it, you're caricaturing it almost out of existence. No, that's not what I think. And I think anybody listening to what I've said knows it's not what I think. If you haven't been listening, I'm not prepared to go through it all again. But you can read my book and you can find out. But no, it's not just it's a serious problem. And it's not one to laugh at. Because do you know anybody who's ended up looking after someone who's become mentally ill after cannabis use? Do you? Do you? I get this. One of the things about being a national newspaper columnist is people get in touch with you. Just people. One who got in touch with me a couple of years ago, her husband, for all his life, a skilled carpenter and woodworker, had been smoking cannabis all the time, not actually skunk, the one which most people smoke, but actually a supply of the old style stuff. And she'd said, I'm worried about this, I don't think it's too unique. And he said, no, nothing to worry about. Until the morning when, out of the blue, he became so violent that she had to call the police, and it took, I think, a dozen of them to drag him out of the house. And he's been since then in the locked ward where she occasionally goes to visit him. This is not something to laugh at or something mild. If I believe that if anybody embarked seriously on the research and the correlation between these things, they would find it was absolutely clear. If you think that it's just something vague or mild, look at the work of Sir Robin Murray, one of the most distinguished psychiatrists in the country, and what he's been doing in South London over the past many years, and see what he thinks before you dismiss it as that. And that's the first link in your deliberate derision and distortion of what I said, and an irresponsible and foolish one, which I can't say strongly enough is a mistake on your part, and one which I hope you don't try and spread. Secondly, well, no, I do. I think the damage is done. Damage is done terribly to people's lives. People say, well, it's my body. People say it's my body. I can do what I like with it, but it's not true. You see, because people have to look after you. And they have to look after. They have to look after you. I'm answering your point. If you'll let me.
No, sorry.
They have to look after.
No, excuse me, shush please,
They have to. I'm sorry, I was talking. What was it?
I'll say that to shop. I said it to be quite so you could speak.
No, they have to look after you for the rest of your life. And this is terrible misery.
And for that,
And it wasn't.
Can you let him
You
speak?
can't stop, can you? And it wasn't. And this is possibly the most serious thing I've said all evening, and you interrupt me doing it, and you smile. And I find that distressing. I don't think it's a light matter. I don't think it's one to. Do you know how long it took to establish that the link between cigarette smoking and lung cancer wasn't just a correlation?
I know that the answer to that is
A
irrelevant.
long time. It's completely relevant because at the moment when the correlation became clear to those who were doing the research, they understood that this was something they had to do something about. They didn't wait for the strong, meaningful correlation. Look, is it a huge surprise that people who suck into their lungs large quantities of vegetable smoke get lung problems? Is it a huge surprise that people who smoke or take in other ways a powerful mind-altering drug which changes their consciousness become mentally ill? Is it the kind of correlation which would surprise you? I mean, if people who smoke marijuana developed green toenails, then you might say, maybe there's a collection, maybe there's not. But this isn't that kind of correlation. It's a meaningful correlation. You continue to smile. It isn't funny. And it wasn't funny for Patrick and Henry Kober and their family. And it won't be funny for anyone else who happens to. I can see that you think that it is. Do you know what? I feel profoundly sorry.
Sure. So obviously you said that you don't feel like what you proposed will be enacted anytime soon, but one way I see these kind of issues normally getting involved is you have to put them on the national agenda. Obviously with your status as a bit of a column, radio broadcasts, how do you think you can get this on the agenda so that the people in Parliament will pay attention in the way that you hope they do?
I wish I knew. All I can tell you is this, that it's now nearly 50 years since I was a university student. But the funny thing is, and at the time I was a homicidal Bolshevik who rejected almost everything, and rejected with a great deal of contempt almost everything which was believed as being right and good at the time. And the parts of my time at university I remember most clearly are when people stood up to me. And didn't. So many of my fellow students, so many of the people who were teaching me, they indulged me in this idiocy. But the ones I remember, nearly half a century later, are the ones who told me that they disagreed with me and stood up to me and weren't afraid of the fact that I was young and passionate and all those other things which they relied on. So it's just possible that if I make this point now, that in a future inconceivable to all of us, because the world that exists around us now is unrecognizable from the one that existed when I was at university, that what I say now might make some difference. It's a hope I have. I may be completely wrong. But if I'd done nothing, I would have nothing to hope for.
Jake.
I don't think you're hoping in vain. I'd like to ask you something on the libertarian point, if that's okay. Something you wouldn't mind you clarifying.
I can see no reason why not.
So you made the point that when someone says in the classic argument, the government has no business, what I do with my body, it's mine. You make the point that, okay, fine, but someone has to look after you, be it the state or your family, right?
Yeah.
If you intervene with drugs and you arrest people, even though you think there'll be less people, there's still an element of the government looks after you, it's just in prison. The only distinction I can see is that if you keep it either decriminalised or legal, you have the same element of care involved for the state, but there's a preservation at least of the personal freedom to take it.
What is care of which you speak?
I'm assuming when you said that people have to care for you, you meant either family and friends
Yeah.
or the NHS.
Well, it's usually family and friends because the NHS is almost totally uninterested in mental illness. And that's one problem which people find in this case, is a huge difficulty finding hospital beds even when they're desperate.
So do you think that if we had hypothetically an NHS that was capable of looking after people who had annihilated their brains, it would be okay-ish to at
placing an indirect burden, aren't you? You're saying, maybe you won't have to do it yourself, but you have to pay for it. Why should people who spend 40 or 50 or 60 hours a week working hard have to pay taxes to look after people who deliberately fried their brains and cease to be rational or productive or useful members of society? It's, that money should be reserved for those people whose horrible misfortunes have happened, not to people who deliberately brought damage onto themselves by knowingly doing something foolish.
Wouldn't you still have to pay for putting them in prison?
Well, yes, you do have to, but putting people in prison is not actually, as an intelligent judge said many years ago to a horse thief when he was about to hang, I'm not hanging you because you stole a horse, I'm hanging you to put other people who are stealing other horses. And the purpose of prison is a deterrent. Prison doesn't, have you ever been in prison?
Have I?
Yeah.
No.
Try and stay away, but they are not places where people are cured of anything.
They're not places
Where people are cured of anything. Nobody's cured of anything. Prisons are dreadful places. The best thing is to stay out of them. They don't. The only good they do is to the people who are frightened of going to them by the fact that other people are going to them. And it's a terrible thing. It's much like maintaining armies. Have you ever seen a war zone? What even nice, civilized, democratic armies do to people is horrible, but we maintain them because the alternative is worse. And prison is more or less on that same scale. It's an unpleasant thing we do because we have to, because if we didn't do it, we'd be worse off than if we did. If you don't, I don't know whether any of you are interested in going into politics, but if you don't want to take that kind of responsibility, I advise you to stay away from it, because it's much better not to go into politics at all, than to go into politics and have power, and not be prepared to take responsibility for defending other people from evil, which is your most fundamental duty.
Richard?
I just wanted to say, as someone that's seen it firsthand, the effects of what it does to people, long-term marijuana use, you're completely right. Prevention is far better than cure, and going to prison, it doesn't help. It doesn't help, but the thing is, you need to be harsher on it to stop it in the first place, basically. And you can get more drugs in prison and far easier than you can on the outside. But as someone that's seen it happen firsthand, someone who's close to them, I wholeheartedly agree. You need to be tougher on it to prevent it in the first place.
Thank you.
Okay, I've got a question. Sorry. Yeah, okay.
Me?
Not you.
You mentioned that if cannabis penalties were harsher, people essentially would risk taking it.
Sorry, I didn't quite hear that.
You mentioned that if cannabis penalties were harsher, you would have said that people essentially wouldn't risk taking it. If you, for example, look at countries where capital punishment is enforced, you can see that the murder rate is kind of low.
Oh, the capital punishment. Let's not have that in. Can we just make sure that there are no more questions about capital punishment, or we're here all night, and I won't get it home. But it's a simple fact about capital punishment in the United States, which I have not merely studied in detail but witnessed, that it doesn't really exist. That if you compare the number of people executed in those states which have the death penalty and use it at all, with the number of homicides, it is trivial beyond belief. And the chances of being executed for a murder, even if you're convicted in court for it, are tiny. Doesn't exist in those states, such as Texas, as a deterrent. It exists as a political gesture by the government of the state, which wishes to appear tough, but isn't actually prepared to do it. Even if you are convicted of a murder in Texas and executed, the chances are you will have forgotten what you did by the time they executed you, because it takes so long. And most people on death row die of old age. So the reason why the death penalty has no effect is because it doesn't really exist in those who are engaged in the kind of actions, particularly stranger murders, that is to say, the person who kills the person who's robbed or kills the person who's raped, which is the type of murder which capital punishment is most effective against, isn't it? But those people don't seriously believe it exists. The point I repeatedly make is where the law is effectively applied, and that means enforcement of the law by the police and punishment of the offence by courts in a serious fashion, or on a first or a second encounter, such as Japan and South Korea, the use of drugs is substantially lower. Deterrence does work, and where it's properly applied. Where it's not properly applied.
Ivan?
So I can see that possibly the correlation might be, could be fearful of drug carriers like that. But there are other things and goods people consume that have a negative effect on their health, like steak and generally red meat. And so I just want to test what you think, what your limits are on people consuming goods that are bad for them and making it illegal. So would you ban things like steak?
Well, you're starting from the wrong. Steak is not illegal, and no one is proposing to make it illegal after it has been illegal and people have been punished for consuming it. But the trafficking of steak is not. People are not arrested in court. It isn't comparable. But, so this is basically, and why spit on your luck? We are lucky enough still to have, at the time, when the active ingredients of cannabis, particularly tetrahydrocannabinol, its most powerful one, were not even discovered until I think the early 60s. Our knowledge of it and its effects on operation have been growing enormously in the past few years, and the work that's being done on the correlation between it and mental illness is only really just beginning. But by great good fortune, it is already illegal. We don't have to make it illegal, it is already illegal. All we need to do is to start enforcing the law that we have. There is, as far as I know, no parallel with that, particularly in the area of steak.
I mean, it's a carcinogen. It's been proven.
I didn't say it wasn't. I said it wasn't. It wasn't illegal. It's not in the criminal code. There is no Dangerous Steaks Act. If there were, then we might have an argument about this.
But
there isn't one, for one reason or another. And it could be because people have more of a sense of proportion than you do. But whatever it is, no one has ever attempted to set up a United Nations Convention making the consumption of beef steak illegal. I think I've made that point enough.
Peter, Oliver, I've just got a question more on, you talked obviously about the fact you're here, which is great, debating it, one from the topic and two from actually watching how you approach this. It's quite a hard kind of uphill struggle, as I think you've said. What about on the approach that you use? Apart from debate, say you're writing a column, etc., the difference between asking thought-provoking questions rather than, say, using what many people would do, which is statements or kind of descriptions that can almost lead them into an area that they can be attacked. What do you think of the power of kind of using questions more to actually provoke thought? Very carefully selected questions.
I write in several different forms. Yeah. I write a weekly newspaper column in which I get, and this is a fantastic privilege, and you mustn't take this as a complaint, but I get generally something like 1,100 words, which cannot, except in exceptional circumstances, be on one subject alone. Yeah. Usually needs to be on 3 or 4, so my main item probably can't exceed 700 words at the outside. To say what I think is the most important thing of the week and what I think about it. And generally, in a newspaper column, you are addressing, and this is a fact, people who want to be reassured, that they're not alone in what they think. And I have absolutely no objection to reassuring people that they're not alone in what they think. I think it's an important part of what I do. In a blog, then I might be setting out to argue with a much smaller number of people, many of whom don't start out by disagreeing with me and not seeking reassurance from. In a debate, I simply throw myself open to anybody who cares to come. In a book, then I spend some years of hard work and research and writing, going into detail into why what I think makes sense to me and explaining it in ways which other people can examine, and if I'm lucky, read and pay attention to. It's very hard. This book, for instance, was murdered by the book review industry, which by and large did not review it at all. So I even have relatives who don't have it, which is very frustrating because people think, and this is quite funny if you've done it, that you write books for money.
I used to
You'd be
I used to
better
work
off probably flipping burgers if you wanted to make money in an expenditure of time versus what you get paid. I did once get paid quite a lot of money for a book, but it was accidental. It wasn't to do with that, but it certainly wasn't this one. And you don't set out to do that. And you actually do it because you've got something to say and you've done some original research and you want to know what it is.
Yeah.
And it's quite frustrating, but there it is, it's there, and if you're interested, and I do say this, any library is to exist, any library will get this book for nothing, or maybe a 50p fee or whatever it is for interlibrary loan. It is, everything that I've said here is backed up with research and fact and history, some of which will surprise you considerably. And I do recommend also, not because I agree with it, but because particularly the section of addiction in it, a book by someone who I disagree with almost totally on everything else, Joe Harry, Chasing the Screen, because whatever Joe Harry may or may not be, and I've debated with him on the internet and you can find it, he takes the subject seriously. He's a serious individual on this matter, and I think it's interesting to see how close he and I come, although we come from completely different perspectives on the issue of addiction. So, but it's you write in different ways for different things.
Sure.
And in a debate like this, where I haven't got a limitless time, I've got a lot of time, I will take longer. I will take more of your time up because you've invited me here. That I might do on a television debate where I've probably got 45 seconds to make my point or something.
So basically, maybe a difference between
it's all different.
Channel and audience. Maybe that's two kind of. Newspapers one channel.
I don't know whether I get it right or not. There's no way of being sure whether you've got it right or not. And I'm sure that on some occasions I've got it wrong. One of the interesting things that I found on this debate is that the more conciliatory I've tried to be, the more I've met my opponents on their own terms, the more merciful I've been to them, the more I've lost a vote. The harder I've been, and the more relentless I've been, and the more serious I've been about what I regard to be a major threat to public health and indeed a terrible outbreak of cynical greed, the more I tend to persuade people, which is interesting, because you would normally think that the nice approach would work, but it hasn't. And since you asked, that's the answer.
No, thank you very much.
Jake?
If I might ask two questions again. One
You're terribly polite about this.
The first one was, obviously, if you introduce deterrence, people don't commit the crime as much because they can rationally decide that this is a very bad idea. Do you not recognise, well, obviously not, but do you not see that people like me perhaps might not use the drug because we can rationalise that it will make us very ill? Is this what you meant earlier when you said that teenagers think they're immortal?
Yeah, I had a motorcycle, which I should not have been allowed to have. And nothing could persuade me, no plea or begging for anything could persuade me, which is unwise. Until the afternoon when I rode it into the side of a pork pie lorry. And luckily for me, the company which owned the pork pie lorry was very advanced and modern for 1969 and equipped its vans with two-way radios, so an ambulance was summoned in time, otherwise I'd only have one leg. And after that, I can tell you, it hurt an awful lot. Just short of blackout. After that, I understood why it was people like me shouldn't have been riding motorbikes. Until then, I didn't. It was a hard lesson, and one which I got away with rather lightly, considering I didn't actually manage to kill anybody else, which has always been the greatest relief in my life. But the truth is that I think people at that age are generally unable to believe in the lurking dangers which their parents particularly see for them over the horizon. They don't think they're there. But it's because they're too big, they're too disastrous. But if you know, maybe if you see on the television that a certain rock star has been arrested and charged for possession of a certain drug, and then that he goes to prison because it's found to be a second offence, and that's the law, you'll pay attention. Oddly enough, one of my most formative years was 50 years ago, 1967, the year when two of the Rolling Stones were arrested in what was at one time a very famous arrest at a farmhouse in West Wittering, the one where Marianne Faithfull is supposed to be doing all kinds of things, which I'm not sure whether she was or not. And their prosecution was extremely interesting. And first of all, I thought, the authorities are taking drugs seriously, because initially they were sent to prison. and then almost the entire establishment, from the editor of the Times to a very powerful lawyer, Michael Havers, father of Nigel, who later became Attorney General of the Conservative government, were mobilised to get them out. And at that point I realised they are serious. And I think a lot of other people realised they weren't serious as well. It was quite plain that although the judge who originally sent them to prison meant what he said, the authorities had decided they were going to go soft on it. And they have. This is leaving aside any arguments about the safety or otherwise of the conviction, which I don't want to have. They were free on appeal, and they were said not to have committed the offences for which they were originally charged in prison. But to me, as a stroppy teenager, this seemed to me to be evidence that they weren't really serious and that taking drugs was something you could get away with.
My second question was, I've been wrapped up in one of the infamous Twitter debates, and one of the things I noticed was that people who disagreed with you tended to insult you quite a lot instead of arguing with you on the point. How much of that dissuades you from posting on Twitter, where it's very difficult to have a proper argument about something?
I have a rule. It's called the presumption of intelligence. It's much like the presumption of innocence. I presume people are intelligent until it's been proved beyond reasonable doubt that they're stupid. After that, as far as I'm concerned, I can say what I like to them, and I do. And actually I quite enjoy it. Look, I've been insulted by experts, and I really am not particularly bothered by the very inexpert people who insult me on Twitter. Many of them have all the intellectual sting of slot machines. It just isn't really a big problem.
Okay, we've got time for one more question.
On the note of Twitter, I was going to ask something related to what I read something you tweeted a couple of months ago, or some clarification, because you talked about researching certain notable crimes and their links with mental illness and then to marijuana. And you were tweeting a couple of months ago at least about the events in places like Paris and Belgium and the links of those who took part in that with marijuana, and I was wondering if you've done further research on that. And
each time one of these terrorist events taking place, I wait until more information becomes available, and I've found that almost invariably it's not total. And this is also true with rampage killings, these ghastly campus shootings and school shootings and shopping mall shootings, which happen so much in North America. Almost always you will find that the person involved has been under the influence of some mind-altering drug. It's not always the same one, it's not always an illegal drug. In some cases it's antidepressants, a drug about which I'm very suspicious. In some cases, it gets Anders Breivik. We only know this thanks to his own testimony. He was a long-term user of steroids. In many cases, marijuana. And people say to me, oh, you're trying to excuse Islamists and this kind of rubbish. And I said, no, all I'm saying is that most crime is not reported properly. When I was a newspaper reporter, a provincial newspaper reporter in a small town, we reported all the crime. We sat in court most of it. It was a lot of what I did. That barely happens now. Most crime is not even reported. The only crime which is thoroughly reported in detail tends to be either these rampage killings or terrorist attacks. And therefore it is a very interesting subset of violent crime where the criminal's background has been examined to some extent. And it is astonishing in how many cases here the people involved have been long-term drug users. In some cases marijuana, in some cases I say steroids, in a lot of cases prescription drugs. Steroids again were involved in the nightclub shooting in Florida, which is they've also been involved in some other killings in the northeast of England. The Raoul Moat episode, some of you may remember. But it's not just a matter of drugs. It's a matter of there's a very large number of mind-altering drugs which are some legal, some illegal, which are loose in our society. And I've seen this resort, which so many people make to mind-altering drugs, the shadow of, I don't know how many of you read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. How many of you read Aldous Huxley's Brave New World? Well, I'm glad that you have, all of you should read it. It is a far, far better dystopian novel than much more fussed about 1984 by George Orwell, because it is very much closer to the truth. And one of the features of it is that society is more or less controlled by a drug called soma, which has been invented. It can't actually exist because it is a mind-altering drug which will make you happy, which also has no downsides at all. But it is taken in large quantities by people to make themselves happy when they're unhappy, to take what they call soma holidays. It's even sprayed on people who take part in riots. And at the end of the riot, they're all lolling around, kissing each other and hugging the police. It is a pleasure drug by which society is controlled. And Huxley invented it because he said he was afraid that in the society to come, people would come to love their own oppression. And he thought that drugs might be the way in which they did it. And the interesting thing about that is that soma was the deliberately chosen name of the organisation which published the advertisement in the Times calling for the legalisation of cannabis. So it all comes around in a nice, neat circle, and that's where I should go.
Thank you everybody for coming today, and thank you Peter for coming in, and there'll be a few minutes if you have any personal questions to ask Peter, you can do that, and I assume not.